Are you ready?
Armies began Atlantic Ocean.
See more about grit. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the History Things Podcast Field Video Exclusive. Joining me today is my co-host with the most, Mr. Matt Borders. How you doing, big guy?
Doing great, buddy. Great to be back in the field doing some hands-on history.
Absolutely. Today we are joining you live from Warrenton Cemetery, which is in Warrenton, Virginia. Warrenton Cemetery is the final resting place of several notable Confederate soldiers and commanders. Just off screen to our right is the memorial to 600 fallen Confederate soldiers, and just behind us here in this row of stones is one of the Civil War's most notable figures. You could say a celebrity of sorts. This is the Mosby family plot behind us here. Just behind this white stone is the grave of the gray ghost, John Singleton, Mosby himself. But we're not here to talk about Confederate or any partisan ranger activity during the war.
That's right.
Come back later, we'll get to that one. Today we're here actually to continue a story we started telling you a few months back, an 1862 story. So Matt and I, last time we joined you in the field, we joined you for the Maryland campaign. We took you all the way from the end of the Second Battle of Bull Run, or Second Manassas. We took you through Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the North, all the way through McClellan's pursuit of him through Maryland, and ultimately culminating at the single bloodiest day in American history, the Battle of Antietam. We wrapped up that story with the action at Shepherdstown, which took place a few days after Antietam, and we sort of said, we'll see you next time. Well, obviously, here's next time. A lot of life, a lot of career stuff. Obviously, we're still living in the middle of the pandemic, so a lot of things brought us to waiting a little bit to get to you here, but we're going to pick that story back up. And we're going to take you from right around the end of September all the way right up to the beginning of December. And to help us do that, Matt's going to set the stage, because we're going to get into a military campaign, I guess, that is often overlooked, borderline forgotten.
Absolutely.
As far as the if you used Antietam and Fredericksburg battles as bookends, this is an action of the war that often gets kind of glossed over entirely. So Matt, take us into the action between the Battle of Antietam and the Battle of Fredericksburg.
Sure, Pat. Basically what's going to happen is following the Battle of Antietam, both armies are going to pull back and go into rest and resupply mode. Most folks are familiar with General McClellan sitting around for a few weeks following Antietam, but Lee's army will do the same thing. In fact, Robert E. Lee's two wing commanders, both General Longstreet and Jackson, would tell Lee that he has to pull his forces back and rest and resupply his army.
Remember, guys, 1862 has been a hot summer. I mean, essentially starting down around June on the peninsula, all the way up to the end of our Maryland campaign story, both these armies have been fighting, marching, and just overall campaigning, which is rough.
Absolutely.
When we talk about the really ragtag, tattered Confederate look, the Union Army looks pretty nasty too. This is the worst both armies are going to look in the field. So when Matt's talking about obviously McClellan, we know, sitting on his laurels a little bit, and Robert E. Lee also does that, there's a need for that. These guys are all exhausted. So here we are at this moment of exhale.
Yep, that's exactly right, Pat. And for about a month, these two armies are going to be resting and resupplying. The Union Army of the Potomac is going to move back to the Potomac River and stretch out, covering the various crossing points to make sure Lee doesn't come back. In fact, he does think about coming back at one point, so it's good that the federal troops were there. But there's also going to be a number of things that occur in early October, just prior to the beginning of what Pat was talking about, the Loudoun Valley campaign. On the 1st through the 4th of October, of course, the Army of the Potomac has a presidential visit. Abraham Lincoln himself would come out to the battlefields of both South Mountain and Antietam to view the fields, discuss the situation with McClellan, and perhaps prod him a little bit to see what was going on with the army. And of course, he wants to see the men. Now, shortly thereafter, we're going to have a raid across the Potomac River. The cavalry raid of Jeb Stuart is going to actually begin on the 10th of October and move into Maryland and up into Pennsylvania before slipping back across the Potomac back into Virginia on the 12th of October. Following that, we would have a series of reconnaissance actions and cavalry actions by the Union Army as they're beginning to probe into northern Virginia around the area of not only Shepherdstown but also Harper's Ferry and beyond. They're going to go out to Charlestown, things like that, really trying to figure out where Lee is, what he's doing at the time, and what the best routes will be for the next Union advance.
Because remember, the state of these two armies, while they seem similar in terms of their whippedness, is not exactly the same. McClellan is sitting on a lot more fresh troops and supplies than Lee is sitting on. So while McClellan is sitting around sort of assessing and like getting himself sort of like ready to commence his campaign, he's actually kind of borderline ready to do it. So he's kind of trying to figure out where Lee is the whole time, just in case there's an opportunity to get in there and strike while Lee is recharging his batteries.
Right, and one of the avenues that he's looking at is the Loudoun Valley. Now, he'd been given a couple of options by the Lincoln administration, either moving into the Shenandoah to go directly at Lee's forces, which had fallen back towards Winchester, or to move into the Loudoun Valley, a slightly closer to Washington route, in an attempt to get in between Lee and Richmond. McClellan will actually choose the Loudoun Valley route, excuse me, and he is going to begin advancing his forces on October 26th.
Wait, time out. You're just blowing up Civil War narratives left and right now, Matt. Did you just say that he worked with Washington? Washington gave him a set of choices. McClellan chose one and is actually moving?
That is exactly right. Now, he is going to be choosing the route that would get him additional reinforcements. Both routes were going to get him some additional reinforcements, but he's going to be able to receive more on the Loudoun Valley route because it's closer to D.C., closer to those defenses. He would push across the Potomac River on October 26, 1862, down at Berlin, Maryland.
Berlin, Maryland. Why does that sound familiar? That's near Ocean City, right? So, short history lesson. Once upon a time in Maryland, there were two towns named Berlin. One right outside of Ocean City on the eastern shore, and another one right across from Lovettsville, Virginia.
That's right.
Which is modern-day Brunswick, Maryland. Postal Service hated that there were two towns with the same name, and as they modernized, they needed to sort of settle that. So the older of the two, out near Ocean City, got to keep their name, and Berlin, right across from Lovettsville, had to change its name to modern-day Brunswick. So when Matt's talking about Berlin, he's talking about 2020 Brunswick, Maryland.
That's exactly right. And on the 26th of October, Pleasanton's cavalry, the Union cavalry, and the Union 9th Corps are going to advance across a pontoon bridge. Eventually, two pontoon bridges would be down there at Brunswick, Berlin, and move into northern Virginia. Now, as this is going on, we would have additional federal forces also crossing up at Harper's Ferry. So they're going to get to cross over the Potomac and then the Shenandoah River to move into northern Virginia. We're going to have a variety of corps moving at this point, moving parallel with the Blue Ridge, pushing south through the Loudoun Valley. They are heading towards where we're at today, Warrenton, Virginia. That would be the ultimate goal of this campaign.
What's the goal? Like, if McClellan is pressing, is he looking to just directly engage Lee and smash him, or is he looking to sort of divide Lee into smaller chunks and just crush him that way?
Well, Lee's army is actually dividing in two at this point, because what's going to happen is Jackson's command will be left around the Winchester area of Virginia in the area of the Shenandoah Valley, while James Longstreet's forces will be sent further south, trying to keep pace with this advancing Union force and eventually, hopefully for Lee, get in front of it. Now, what's going to happen in the Loudoun Valley is beginning on almost immediately, on October 30th, we would actually have Jeb Stuart and his horse soldiers, the famous Confederate cavalry, move into the Loudoun Valley, and it would begin a series of engagements. We would have a pretty brisk fight occur near Mountville, Virginia on the 31st, on Halloween, 1862, and then the very next day, November 1st, we would have the big fight of this campaign, a 3-day engagement known as the Battle of Unison.
Can you imagine? Trick or treat, Confederate cavalry!
Well, that's pretty much what'll happen to the 1st Rhode Island Cav, but that's another story.
Yikes.
Now, the Battle of Unison is a 3-day engagement, and it'll ending on November 3rd. What's interesting about November 3rd? That is also the same day that James Longstreet will have gotten in front of the Union advance and has made it to Culpeper, Virginia, where he will begin to dig in along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad.
Now, this is kind of what McClellan wants to have happen, in a way. He wants to have the Army of Northern Virginia in smaller chunks so that he can kind of envelop them. So you could make the argument that this is actually going to plan as McClellan wants it.
It absolutely is.
How does Washington react to this?
Unfortunately, Washington will react poorly to this because the movement of Longstreet's corps, or his wing at the time, again, the Confederates aren't going to formalize a corps structure quite yet. The movement of Longstreet's wing is going to be seen as a failure on McClellan's part, that he has allowed a portion of Lee's army, or as Washington sees it, Lee's army, to get entirely in front of him and once again block the direct route to Richmond, Virginia. So on the 5th of November, as the results of the midterm elections have come in, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, is going to write an order that would relieve George Brinton McClellan from command of the Army of the Potomac. Now that order is going to take a couple of days to get to McClellan, but he will actually receive the order on the night of November 7th, 1862, not far from here at Rectortown. Now, that order had come in being personally delivered by hand. It's going to first reach the new commander of the Army of the Potomac, General Ambrose Burnside, and Burnside would then go up to Rectortown and inform General McClellan that he was now no longer going to be having a job.
You're fired. Not that brutally, because they were friends, but
exactly.
That's what he was telling him. So there's some Washington politics at play here. If you notice, some of the dates Matt just threw at you, November 3rd, November 5th, November 7th, and Matt just said the word midterm election, right? Yep. So there's a reason that it's happening in this way. You could argue that Lincoln is ready to move on from McClellan way before the midterm elections play out. But McClellan has got a lot of support from Democrats during the war.
Absolutely.
And with the election looming and the Emancipation Proclamation being out there in the preliminary sense, there's a lot of political advantage to having McClellan still around. So you don't want to kind of tip your political favor, with such a precarious position. So McClellan gets to keep his job until basically right after the elections are all done and settled. And it's almost like period on the end of that sentence. Thank you. Goodbye. Yep. So that's kind of what we're dealing with politically at the time, is that McClellan is in his position until it's convenient politically for Lincoln to move on. And that's what happens right around November 5th, is Lincoln's like, cool, we're moving on.
Now, when McClellan receives the order that he is being removed from command, it's almost November 8th. It's very late on the 7th. And what's interesting is the marching orders for the Army of the Potomac had, for the next 2 days, the 8th and 9th, had already been written. They were to continue to push south and gather around where we're at in Warrenton, Virginia. So General Burnside, quite understandably, is going to let those orders run. Why not? The headquarters camp of the Army of the Potomac would come down here to Warrenton, Virginia. In fact, Burnside will ask General McClellan to stay on for a few days to help with this transition process. And on the 10th of November, we're going to have a grand review of a large portion of the Army of the Potomac. The 1st, 2nd, and 5th Corps will be reviewed by General McClellan just prior to his leaving. And the coverage of this review and also his removal of command would go on for days in the northern papers, talking about the grandeur, the feelings of the Army, so forth and so on. Unfortunately for General Burnside, he now no longer has help, and he's going to need to get a plan out there very quickly. In fact, the War Department, the Lincoln administration, is already beginning to ask him what is his next move. And initially, his plans are to basically keep on keeping on, continue the push on the most direct route towards Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital. And so the next logical step, the next step that would have a supply route, specifically a railroad that could help feed the Army of the Potomac, would be Fredericksburg. Now, what's interesting is that Robert E. Lee didn't believe that Fredericksburg was going to be a big deal initially. In fact, he believed that the advance of Burnside's forces would beat him there, and then he would be successful in crossing over the Rappahannock prior to the Confederates being able to get there in force. Now, as we know, we're going to run into some problems regarding some pontoon bridges, the same pontoon bridges we saw up there at Berlin or Brunswick.
Yeah, that's right.
And we're going to talk about those in depth at a different date. Now, before we leave you, though, it would be by the beginning of December 1862, both armies are now gathered along the banks of the Rappahannock outside of Fredericksburg, Virginia.
We're from Frederick, Maryland. Different story.
James Longstreet's forces had begun to arrive on the 20th of November, so just a few days after the lead elements of Burnside's men had gotten there. And then on December 1st, so just 158 years ago, yesterday, General Jackson's forces will arrive. The Army of Northern Virginia is now essentially in force at Fredericksburg, squaring off against the Army of the Potomac.
All right, so as we wrap up here, let's turn our attention to the next spot of our story. Because remember, when we presented the first of our field videos to you, actually the second, because I forgot we did Monocacy earlier this year. When we did the Antietam and the Maryland campaign field videos, we had talked about presenting the Maryland campaign and Antietam storyline as a bigger overall storyline that included the Fredericksburg campaign and battle, because overall they're kind of like bookends of the same military and political season. Right. So one thing we wanted to do was sort of like set the table for that with the action that takes place in the Loudoun Valley. Now, in 1862, we call it the Loudoun Campaign or the Loudoun Valley campaign or the Second Virginia campaign. A lot of campaigns with names, guys. But I just want to be clear, we're not talking about the 1864 Loudoun Valley campaign, which is when General Wesley Merritt goes to this area and basically performs a mock version of what General Sherman's doing in Atlanta, kind of simultaneously. So, but we're talking 1862. And so McClellan, contrary to popular belief, actually does get going. Now, I know that we're not here to dissect the legacy and reputation of General McClellan, but I do feel it's important to just say it very flatly, is that the sort of perception that he does absolutely nothing after Antietam is entirely just wrong.
Correct.
He takes stock of his army. They just went through the worst day in American history. They had been fighting and dying the entire summer along the way to that moment. I mean, ask yourself in a real sense, if you were in command of 100,000 guys that had been marching and fighting and dying and outrunning their supplies, and then just went through the worst day in our nation's history, like, how quickly are you going to get organized and move? How much readiness and logistical prowess do you have to get going? So, try to put your people hat on when you're, like, I guess, assessing historical figures' legacies. Sometimes we superhuman these people, like Stonewall Jackson at Manassas, right? People are people. And McClellan is actually doing a pretty decent job of taking stock of what has just been and what has just happened. And he is coming up with a plan. And Washington's actually working with him. So as much as we know about the Lincoln and McClellan headbutting, like there is some
there's a lot of it.
Yeah, but there's some actual, like, collaboration that's taking place here, and that's where we get going into the valley. The plan is actually going more or less how it's on paper supposed to go, but the politics obviously get involved, and McClellan can't stay. Which, when we were first studying this a few years back, my first question to you was, if the plan was working, why didn't Burnside just take the plan from McClellan and just keep going with it? Well, the analogy I'll use for all you sports fans out there is, imagine if you have a team with really good players, and they're doing a really good job, but the playbook isn't right, it's got to go, and so you fire the coach, but you still have your all-star team. The new coach isn't going to come in and just run the same old plays. He's going to bring in his own playbook. So that's kind of what Burnside's dealing with here. He's now in command of this brand new team of all-stars, and he's kind of got to come up with his own plan, right? You can't just take over McClellan's plan. We fired McClellan because McClellan's plan wasn't working. So there's a lot of just, really cool and deep stuff with this moment of the war, October, November of 1862. It ends with Burnside stealing a march on Robert E. Lee.
He absolutely does.
Like Matt said, right? Lee is not looking to Fredericksburg as a real sort of pinpoint on the map of importance. The Union's really not going to go through that area. And sure enough, he gets caught sleeping. I believe one Union commander says that he caught Bobby Lee with his pants down or something like that.
Something to that extent.
But I mean, it's that kind of, like, it's bad. Like, for a war where we look back, where Robert E. Lee is almost above reproach, in historical senses, right? Almost never makes a mistake. This is a huge mistake, because if all goes well for Burnside, on to Richmond is just weeks away here. So,
right.
So speaking of collaboration, I just dropped that word a minute ago here. We're actually setting the table for the next field video we're getting ready to do. We're getting ready to hang out with a couple of our friends from the collaboration crew. If you remember, Matt and I did the video, the 1864 project, where we talked about the November 1st, did they rewrite the entire Maryland state constitution, or did they just amend it to abolish slavery in the state of Maryland on November 1st?
No, it's a new constitution.
So it's a new state constitution on November 1st, 1864. And we pulled in a bunch of our friends from the history field, especially the public social media history field. And we're going to be hanging out with a couple of our friends. You guys might know Cody Aish and Avery Lentz from the Battles and Banter podcast. We've had Avery on the podcast, obviously, to talk about the Battle of Fredericksburg. Well, we're going to have those fellas join us live next weekend on Sunday, December 13th, the actual battle day. Fredericksburg's a big date soup, so when I say the 13th, we're talking about the big charges at, Marie's Heights and Slaughter Pen Action, stuff like that. But they're going to join us live from the field to help us tell you the final part of our 1862 story. So we're really excited. We've appreciated everybody hanging out with us all along. Usually being in front of the camera is something that I do all on my own. Matt has been great coming out here and doing this with us for the show. So we're really excited that you guys have stuck with us through the late summer and the fall, and now we're on the doorstep of winter. You can see we're all kind of bundled up here. It's pretty cold, but we're really excited, and we're excited to, like I said, just to get into the final part of this, which is the Battle of Fredericksburg. So make sure you check back on our Instagram, which is at the History Things Podcast, or you can follow me on History Things with Pat. You can follow Matt at Matt Borders Books, or follow the guys over on Battles and Banter podcast, because they're going to be doing coverage of this as well. So we look forward to seeing you next Sunday, starting at about 8 a.m. in the morning. We'll be out there on the field filming, so you can start seeing posts a little later in the day. Yep. So we'll see you all then. Thanks for hanging out. I'm Pat. This is Matt. This is the History Things Podcast.
Have a good night.
See you.